J878, Tropical Oyster Culture, English, final mix. Track one, take one.
In Sierra Leone, West Africa, oysters grow in abundance on mangrove roots and are gathered for food. This practice has been carried on for generations. Within the Freetown estuary alone, there are about 100 miles of this natural growth. However, these oysters spend almost half of their life out of water during low tide. When not submerged, they cannot feed. This slows down their growth. The most important source of protein for coastal people in Sierra Leone is fish, but the supply is seasonal. Oysters are available year-round and are a valuable protein supplement. If oysters are farmed, the potential is even greater. Around the world, there are countless miles of fertile mangrove forests and swamps, which foster the growth of oysters and many other marine animals. Mangroves cover most of the eastern coast of Sabah, Malaysia, on the island of Borneo. Here, oysters grow on the floor of the swamp and reach a large size. Tropical mangrove oysters are little different from those of temperate zones, for all edible oysters have a similar anatomy. They are bivalve mollusks with a soft body covered by a thin skin called a mantle, which secretes the shell. There is one adductor muscle which holds the two valves together and controls their opening. There is a mouth at the front end of the gills. The gills are used for respiration and for food collection. In most mangrove oysters, the sexes are separate. The female discharges eggs in a puff to distribute them widely. The male sends out sperm in a steady stream. Thus, fertilization takes place in the open water and cell division begins. In less than 24 hours, 2 shells and a swimming organ have developed. This organ has vibrating hairs which enable the young oyster to move freely. After a week's growth, the young oysters are still invisible to the naked eye. Soon after, a probing foot with a cement gland attaches the oyster to an appropriate, hard, clean surface, where it remains for the rest of its life. In a good breeding season, 10 or more young oysters, now called spat or seed, may attach to 1 square centimeter of surface area. Few of these will actually grow to maturity because of competition for space. Oysters will attach to many types of materials, and such collectors are called culch. The most widely used collectors are mollusk shells. In this case, scallop shells are punched and strung on wire. Sometimes, shells are placed in net bags. Materials have been developed which will slowly disintegrate in water, leaving the detached oysters to grow separately. But cheaper local materials, such as coconut shells dipped in tar, are also used. Asbestos cement strips make good culch material. Bamboo and oyster shells are commonly used as well. The most suitable culch for any given area is determined by availability, efficiency, cost, and the local system of culture. There are many ways to grow oysters. In the temperate zones, suitable intertidal grounds occur. Here the oysters are spread over protected land and harvested after 2 or 3 years of growth. In the tropics, it is difficult to find suitable areas like this, so alternative methods are used. The young oysters may be put on racks in various ways. Sometimes they are placed in trays. They may be attached to stakes or strung on a long line which is supported by floats. Perhaps one of the better known methods is to suspend them from rafts. The tidal and geographic conditions in the Freetown estuary of Sierra Leone make the area suitable for raft culture. In this project, now in its 3rd year, experimental rafts are built with a bamboo frame and oil drum floats.
This is Dare, where we collect most of our seed. And we collect the seed on oyster shells that are unseparated. And when the young seed sets on the unseparated culture, which is the shell, we allow it to get to 2 to 3 centimeters long, and then we separate it. This is what it looks like after it has been separated. The distance is 6 inches apart, that is one bunch to the next. And then we leave them like this, and they grow until they reach the market size.
The farming sites are selected on the basis of the depth of the water, the amount of wave action, the ease of surveillance, and experience from previous growth studies.
We're in an oyster-growing area. Behind me are mangrove swamps, and on these swamps are the wild mangrove oysters. This is an intertidal zone, which means that the wild oysters are out of the water for 8 to 12 hours every day. These are cultured oysters growing suspended from a raft, and these are continually submerged. These are a bunch of wild oysters, and these are a bunch of cultured oysters. And the cultured oysters grow approximately 3 times as big as the wild oysters in less than half the time.
This comparison of shucked oyster meat clearly shows the difference. Cultured oysters grow much larger than wild oysters in a shorter time. After 6 to 8 months of growth, the oysters are of a marketable size. The shells are 7 to 8 centimeters in length at this time. Most of this growth occurs during the dry season, when coastal water salinity is high. In the future, oysters may have to be grown through the rainy season, when salinity is low, so that marketable oysters are available year-round. Growing schedules are being further investigated. After the harvest, oysters are traditionally steamed before shucking in Sierra Leone.
These are cultured oysters from Jui. They are much bigger than the wild oysters. The steaming process partly opens the shells, which makes it easier for the meat to be removed.
After shucking, the oysters are processed. The use of plastic bags is being examined to ensure a safe, hygienic product. Keeping partially cooked oysters for sale in the tropics is a problem. In urban areas, refrigeration is available. The traditional West African methods of boiling, smoking, or drying are probably more suitable for rural distribution. Oyster farming in Sierra Leone is very new. But in Japan, there are records of oyster farming activities as early as the 17th century. In the inland sea, there is a good example of an ancient and highly intensive industry. At one time, only bottom culture was practiced. Today, there is almost a complete transition to the use of rafts. The Japanese oyster culture industry is large. There are over 600 family businesses in the Hiroshima area alone. The shell culch is strung on wires and hung on racks for spat collection during summer, when water temperature is highest. In autumn, the collected seed is moved closer to shore and placed on holding racks for safe storage. In spring, the strings are broken up, and the seed is restrung and suspended from rafts for growing the oysters to maturity. This may take as long as 2 years in these waters. Harvesting is done mechanically. Each string holds about 30 collectors. Approximately 20 oysters grow on each collector. That's 600 oysters per string. One raft will hold up to 600 strings. In total, then, every 2 years, one raft can produce about 360,000 oysters, or 3 tons of meat. There are hundreds of rafts in the Hiroshima area alone. Before the oysters enter the shucking house, they are washed. To handle this quantity, some mechanization is necessary. The Japanese have developed their own tools and methods for shucking oysters, quite different from the traditional rural operation used in Sierra Leone. A professional can shuck up to 3,000 oysters per day. They are paid on the basis of the weight of the oyster meat they shuck. After shucking and washing, the oysters are packaged for distribution. This is one system used in the Hiroshima area for local markets. The Philippine oyster industry is a modest but relatively long-standing one for the tropics. In Cavite Bay near Manila, where the tidal range is small and the water is generally shallow, oysters and mussels are strung on racks constructed of wood or bamboo poles. They are harvested by hand. In deeper water, divers are often needed. In nearby Sabah, Malaysia, an experimental oyster farm has been established. The farming method used here is an intertidal rack system. Trays are constructed first for seed collection, and later to hold the oysters as they grow to maturity. The hard inner core of the coconut shell is one local material that has been tested as a culch. Since they are fibrous, the shells are dipped into a pitch tar mixture, which provides a firm surface for oyster spat to attach. The coconut culch is then laid in trays for seed collection. However, the main collector used in the Sabah project is strips of corrugated asbestos cement. These are placed on edge to avoid collecting silt, which would inhibit oyster spat attachment and growth. Trays containing collectors are placed on racks in areas found to be suitable for spat collection. Some washing is necessary to remove silt, even though the collectors are placed vertically in trays. After about 5 weeks on these grounds, sufficient seed has been collected for transfer to the growing area some distance away. In this experiment, it was convenient to use sawn timber for rack construction. But mangrove poles or bamboo could also be used by any farming enterprise. After several years, silt builds up around the racks and they must be moved to new locations. To hold the strips of culch in a vertical position, supports are prepared. The culch remains here for about 5 months. In Sabah, 1 large and 1 small species are cultivated. At 5 months, the larger species can be identified, chipped off and placed in trays. The smaller ones can be left on the collectors, where they will reach a diameter of about 2 inches, or 5 centimeters. Instead of moving oysters to trays, it may become necessary in the future to allow both species to grow to maturity on the asbestos strips. Compared to the raft method used in Sierra Leone, this rack and tray system demands much labor. And in a commercial venture, the number of operations will probably have to be reduced.
Now is the low tide period. As you see, the tide is coming in, and during the low tide period, all these oysters, trays, and racks is going to expose for a period of about 3 hours. And during the high tide period, this place is going to be submerged at a depth of about 8 feet, or that is to say, all these oysters, trays, and racks is about 6 feet below the water surface.
In the present system, the oysters are gathered for market a year after they are transferred to the trays. At this time, they have grown for a total of 18 months.
By the 18 months, most of the oysters has attained a size like this. It is almost 4 or 5 inches. And some of the oysters are even bigger. They are about 8 to 9 inches like this. These oysters are really marketable. And the average weight of the oyster is about 240 grams, with a meat content of 20 to 22 grams each.
Both the Sabah and Sierra Leone systems have shown positive results. No doubt modifications will be made in the future as more biological and economic data are obtained. There are other factors to be taken into account in raising oysters. To develop an oyster culture system properly, certain hydrographic and biological information is required. The temperature and salinity of the water influences both the breeding season and the growth of oysters. These measurements can be taken with a salinometer. The Secchi disc is used to determine water clarity, a rough measure of the amount of silt and food in the water. The peak of the spawning period is determined by plankton sampling. With the microscope, these samples will show the presence of young oysters in the water. This indicates when to put out the spat collectors. Another factor is fouling.
Here, I'm squatting on a raft of cultured oysters. Now, these oysters are submerged for 24 hours a day, therefore they grow bigger and faster than the wild mangrove oysters, which are out of the water for about 12 hours each day. But by submerging the oysters, we have a problem of fouling. And here you can see some of the fouling organisms. There are barnacles, hydroids, bryozoa, and some mussels.
This fouling is not extensive. Oysters can stand considerable amounts of such competition without serious effects. Methods of control are labor-intensive and costly. It is better to grow oysters in areas where and during the season when fouling is at a minimum. Predators also pose difficulties. Oyster drills attach themselves and bore holes through the shell to feed on the meat. A good percentage of the oyster crop may be killed off in this way.
One of the problems we have is the predators. Crab is one of the predators, and this is considered as most disastrous or destructive predators we have. And within 1 week, this creature may finish a whole lot of the spat here.
The oyster mortality rate may be reduced to an acceptable level by installing traps for crabs and drills in the growing areas. There are other problems. Industries often come into conflict with oyster culture activities. These logs could do a great deal of damage to oyster racks if they drifted loose by accident. Log dumping operations cause bark deposits, which can foul the bottom, killing marine organisms in the vicinity. The mangrove environment is relatively productive, but to remain so, the natural balance has to be maintained. Any operation that affects water or bottom quality, such as the destruction of the mangroves themselves, may, by disturbing this balance, have serious and long-lasting effects. To grow oysters, it is necessary to acquire property rights. Oyster farms cannot be established where boats have the right to move freely. Competition for space may occur with the fishing industry. The historic rights of fishermen have to be respected. Many grounds have been theirs for generations. The ideal situation is where fishermen become oyster farmers, or where the two work together for their mutual benefit. Fishermen can keep an eye on oyster farm structures, and oyster rafts attract fish for them. The proximity of human settlements often presents pollution problems, either in the form of sewage or industrial wastes. Sewage bacteria do not harm oysters, but may cause serious illness in humans when the oysters are eaten. Industrial pollution is more difficult to eradicate. If possible, sites remote from built-up areas should be selected. To avoid potential problems, oysters may be artificially purified by holding them for 2 days in chlorinated water, or water treated with ultraviolet light. During this time, the oyster will flush itself of any dangerous bacteria. Many countries have stringent regulations for the sanitary control of the oyster industry. Oysters can also be purified naturally by moving them from the polluted area to one shown by tests to be pollution-free. However, none of these problems outweigh the prospects for oyster culture in the tropics, where seed supply is usually unlimited and where marketable oysters can be produced in a year or less in some areas. The prospects may be more limited by the problems of transferring oyster culture knowledge and technology to local people. But more and more people will culture oysters when they see the potential. There is potential for improving health as well. Protein deficiency is the basis for many health problems. Through intensive cultivation in the coastal waters of many tropical countries, oysters could become a readily available source of protein for people throughout the developing world.